Ladies and gentlemen, in this episode of Today's History Moment, we are actually at Christ Church. Christ Church in Philadelphia. And right before me, you could probably look all the way up and see the steeple and the belfry. That was the tallest building in North America. From 1754 all the way to about 1810. It was the tallest building in Philadelphia until 1856. So for 102 years, that was the tallest building in the city of Philadelphia, and it was the tallest building in North America. Both British North America, when the British were in control of this area, but also when the United States began. Essentially, this was 1776's version of the Empire State Building. If you actually look at the top of the tower, you'll see that it's actually whitewashed. Now, the reason why that's a big deal is because in the 1750s, Philadelphia became the first city to actually have nighttime street lighting in North America. Paris, France actually had it before we did. And the reason why that's a big deal is because, ladies and gentlemen, at nighttime, not only could you travel at night from your house or going to a tavern or going to see a friend. If you lived in Philadelphia, you actually had a nightlife back in the 1750s. But it also means that with the streets being lit at night, it reflected against the whitewashed tower, and you could actually see a skyline at night, even though you didn't have electricity, which is kind of cool. Anyway, this church is really amazing, but today we're actually going to talk about Philadelphia in the 1750s and 1760s. The reason why that's a big deal is because we often think about the American Revolution, for example, all kinds of things that led to the forming of the United States. We kind of lose sight of what people were going through. If you were, let's just say, a merchant, pretty well-to-do individual, and you came from a British background, you saw yourself as basically the elite, the social elite of that day. If you were a working class individual, you were really struggling because you were overtaxed and overregulated. And the reason for this was because the 7 Years' War, which here in America was known as the French and Indian War, meant that the British government had to tax the colonies in order to pay for the defense of the colonies. In Westminster, which is in London where Parliament met, their mindset was that if we have to pay to protect you with our soldiers, you should pay with your taxes. And that's basically why you had the intolerable acts, like the Stamp Act and all kinds of things. Sugar taxes and everything else. If you wanted to purchase a piece of paper to do business, they taxed every page that you purchased, and it had the stamp of the king on it. So if you were working class, it was really an enormous expense that you had to deal with. It pretty much could ruin your business. And a lot of people were very angry and began to get ready to rebel. Now, at that particular time, people like Benjamin Franklin were the American representative in London, and he and many of these social elite believed that since this was a British colony and since Philadelphia was the second largest city only to London, they were actually expecting Philadelphia to be another London. They thought that you would have the House of Parliament meeting in Philadelphia. You would have a version of the Tower of London in Philadelphia. They even thought that King George III, more than likely, would even have a colonial palace in or around Philadelphia because they felt themselves as being very British. The thing is, he was in London, and a lot of people like Thomas Paine were in London as well. And his wife was back here in Philadelphia over there at 3rd and Market, which is about a block away from where we are. And his wife actually saw how angry the actual people who lived in this city were getting. And she was writing her husband back in London saying, hey, you're setting all kinds of tempers alight over here, and people think you're out of touch with what the common man is going through. You need to understand what's actually happening. So that's really basically what was going on in the 1760s and early 1770s in cosmopolitan Philadelphia. Now I'm going to also say this. Philadelphia was not alone. You had cities like Baltimore, Charleston, New York, Boston that were feeling the same thing at that time. Of course, this is a multicultural city. You had a lot of Native Americans living here, African Americans living here, some of which were free, some of which were enslaved. You had a lot of Acadian French living here from what is now New Brunswick and the coast of Canada, and you have some Spanish that were coming here as well. So it was a very, very mixed culture. You had Dutch, you had Swedes that were also living in Philadelphia as well, and they were sharing the same fate because no matter what type of work they did, if they were free, they had to pay the same tax. Of course, in the case of Native Americans, they didn't pay the tax if they were living outside of society to a degree, and African Americans didn't pay the tax, of course, if they were enslaved, because of the simple fact that they weren't getting paid at all, which also was a crime against humanity. Now, I should also note that at that time here in Philadelphia, you also had the fact that as early as 1695, you had demonstrations against slavery. So you had quite a few people who were against that as well. So it was a very, very contentious time, to say the least. As we close with the chapter, and if you hear any noise, it's because there's a class behind me with a lot of young kids who are also enjoying this history moment. But one thing to remember also about that period of time in Philadelphia and in the United States, a lot of individuals really did not like being overtaxed, and what was worse is they felt that they did not have a say in their government. And to this very day, that is a common complaint. You have people who don't want to pay high taxes. You have people who may belong to a particular political ideology, and they feel like they're not being represented in national government. And unfortunately, it adds to the height of tension that we see socially. Also, in closing, that as we look at this particular church itself, it was founded in 1695, Christ Church. The current building is actually the second church. The first church, which was built in 1695, was much, 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 much smaller. You could actually touch the ceiling with your hands. The original church bell was hung from a tree outside of the church on 2nd Street, and the original Christ Church was eventually replaced by this current structure in the 1730s and 40s. And this particular tower was built in 1753 and 1754. So while this church is, of course, notorious for its history and famous for its history, which would be more accurate probably, it saw a lot of the tension that we're talking about as the country begins and starts to march towards independence from the crown, which was not an easy affair and certainly not a simple one. So, I'll see you soon.